So today we're going to be looking at ecosystems and agriculture. But before we get into it, let's review. All right, so last class we talked about the history of agriculture. And we said that agriculture developed around 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, pretty much across the globe, right? It didn't just evolve in one place. It started developing in the Middle East and Asia and Mesoamerica and the Amazon, etc. This was a significant change in how humans live, right? For almost 200,000 years, we lived as hunter gatherers, and then all of a sudden we switched to becoming farmers. And what were the causes of this, right? And we started looking at those. We saw that around 12,000 years ago, the temperature of the earth started rising. And as we got a warmer temperature, we had increased plant productivity of our wild plants and our wild ancestors of our cultivated plants now. This increased plant productivity likely resulted in an increase in human population size. And around this time, this also coincided with a decrease in large megafauna, which were a food source for us. This warming temperature also created better conditions for plant cultivation. So we have environmental conditions that are better for plant cultivation, that are producing more wild plants. We have an increased population, human population, that is going to need more food, and we have a decrease in the amount of large megafauna that we could hunt. And from that concoction, we get agriculture. And agriculture has a number of effects on humans, right? Agriculture produces more food. It is way, way, way more productive than hunting and gathering. We went from a max population size of 10 million people on the earth all the way up to present day, which is about 7.6 billion. So we're able to support way more people. There are all these other consequences of agriculture as well. We start to see a division of labor. Not everyone needs to be farmers. So the farmers can produce all the food, and then people can take up other roles. We see people become more stationary, so we're not hunting and gathering. We don't need to move around, follow game. We can stay where we are, and we see a rise of cities. And again, people can take on different roles in the cities, and we see increases in technology and materials, etc. There are what we would say some initially very negative consequences of agriculture. People had less free time initially. It took more work to farm, more time. They were less healthy. They were eating a less diverse diet, right? They were just eating the things that they were growing instead of this wildly diverse diet of wild animals and plants. Agriculture affected human evolution. One of the ways we looked at was with that lactase persistence. We keep producing lactase throughout adulthood so we can digest milk. And it had a number of environmental effects, a lot of them negative. So from the development of agriculture, we jumped all the way ahead to agriculture since World War II. And we saw that in the United States, there was a shift in our policies and our practices of agriculture really after the Second World War. We saw that the technologies that were developed in the war translated into a number of technologies that could be used for agriculture, both with like mechanization and with fertilizers. We had the development of synthetic fertilizer. And we had government policies that began to favor big farms. So instead of a number of smaller farms, we began to see a fewer very big farms, right? And these big farms were producing massive amounts of product, and they were often big, large monocultures. So they were just producing one type of crop, right? So producing all corn, or producing all wheat, or producing all soy. So we had a number of big farms, and our productivity soared initially, right? We were extremely productive. We were able to produce a whole ton of stuff. But we had some, again, negative consequences. We had the number of farms dropped, especially the number of small farms, right? It was go big or get out of business. We start to see a lot of environmental effects. One of the big ones is a loss of topsoil. That topsoil is our top layer of soil that contains carbon. It also contains all the other living organisms in the soil that break down plant material or animal material into nutrients that our plants can then take up. So if we lose this topsoil, we're losing the nutrient or the nutrients in the soil that our plants need to grow, right? That's a big problem. We've also seen through the application of fertilizer, we have fertilizer runoff that pollutes water bodies and has a whole host of other problems. And we're seeing a loss of species, loss of wild species as we've converted land to farmland and a particular type of farming. We see less diverse habitats. We see loss of habitat, and a lot of species are going extinct. So that's where we left off there. Let's move on now. All right, so you might have seen the title and have been wondering, how do ecosystems relate to agriculture? Well, what I have here are really the two kind of main important points of this entire lecture. The first is that a crop system is an ecosystem. And this is true whether we are talking about a farm field, a garden, an oyster bed, even a greenhouse or a hydroponic tank. They are types of ecosystems. And then the second, probably more important point, is that the more a crop ecosystem varies from the natural ecosystem found in an area, the more inputs and resources are needed to sustain the crops. Right, so that's a real important point, and I'm going to be bringing it up multiple times throughout this lecture, so you're going to see it again. But before we dive into that, let's look at exactly what an ecosystem is. Right, so an ecosystem is a community of living organisms and the abiotic or non-living environment in which they are found. Right, so it's just the living things and the non-living things found in an area. Now, there are four main components of any ecosystem: geologic and soil features, climate, plants, animals, and other biota or just living things, and then humans. And while humans are technically animals, because our impact on the environment is so large, we get grouped into our own separate component. But what we're going to look at briefly now is each of those components and see really how they shape what plants will grow in an area. Because that's kind of what we're concerned with here in this agriculture course. Right, so let's start with geologic and soil features. So there's two main aspects of geologic and soil features that affect plants. The first is the relief of the land, and the second is the soil itself. So when I say relief, what I mean is the horizontal and vertical dimensions of the land. This is essentially, what is our landscape like? Is it mountainous? Are we on a slope? Are we in a valley? Etc. All of these things, that relief, can affect the water drainage of the area, as well as the exposure of the plants there to sun and wind, which can impact our plants in various ways, which we'll look at throughout this course. Right, so that relief is important, where you are located on the landscape. And what's also important is the soil. So your soil is essentially disintegrated rock particles that have been modified by plants, water, and air, combined with dead organic matter and living organisms. That is, when we say soil, that's what we mean. It's not just rock, but it's rock with this organic matter and these living organisms that are found in that soil. Now, soils have different, there are kind of two important features of soils. One is that they have different water holding capacities, and this is based on their particle size. So when we look at soils, when we're looking at the rock particle parts of soils, we see that it can be composed of three main types: sand, silt, and clay. And it's the proportions of each of these that is going to determine the water holding capacity of your soil. So the bigger the particle size, the more water can flow through it, or the more easily, is that I guess that's the proper, the more easily water can flow through your soil. Right, so if you have very sandy soil, like you may find where our campus is located, you're generally going to have water drain through it very fast, and it's going to have poor water holding potential. The smaller the particles, the more the soil is able to hold water. Now, you can go to the extreme of that with clay, which has which is very, very fine particles, and that has extreme water holding potential. And now you can hold too much water, and your soil can get waterlogged, and that's not good for a number of crops. So your texture of your soil is going to determine your water holding capacity, and that's really important. But what's also important is that our soils contain different amounts of organic matter and nutrients. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but that's also going to play a really important role in how really good your soil is for different crops to grow, how fertile your soil is. So these are geologic and soil features. This is one component of an ecosystem, and these are some of the ways in which these features affect what plants grow in an area. Now we also have climate. And when I talk about climate, what I'm really talking about here is our temperature, precipitation, and light. Now each plant has a specific range of tolerance for these factors, right? Our plants have a range of tolerance for temperature. It can exist in this range of temperatures. Same with precipitation and light. But these three things are also really important because they're going to impact plant growth and development. Temperature in particular kind of dictates how fast plants grow, right? The higher the temperature, the faster plant metabolic actions occur, and that increases your plant growth. Precipitation and light are both important and critical for photosynthesis, which plants is the process we'll learn at the end of this semester, is the process that plants are creating food, right? And precipitation and water is also used for a number of other things within our plants. As is light, as we'll learn about. So climate, another aspect of the ecosystem that is important, that affects what plants are going to grow where. We also have plants, animals, and other biota or living things. Now, when we're talking about plants, our plants compete amongst each other for resources, including water, light, and minerals, but we can also take advantage of some of the ways in which different plants grow and utilize those services that they provide in unique ways to make, as we're going to learn about later, to kind of make our agriculture a little more sustainable. Right? So plants compete, but we can also utilize their different ways and they grow. Kind of same with animals. Animals can have both favorable and unfavorable effects on growing plants. When we look at favorable, a really important thing is that soil organisms will improve soil texture and break down organic material. That is a really critical aspect of what animals can do to improve soil, and it's something that we are only now starting to realize and trying to foster that a little bit more in our agriculture. We also have pollinators, right? That's probably well known. The different birds, butterflies, bees that can aid in pollination, bats, all sorts of organisms. But our animals can also have unfavorable effects besides, direct predation, insects preying upon our crop species. I have there overbrowsing by deer. That's a big problem in New Jersey in many of our forests. So both positive and negative effects. Plants, animals, and other biota, the third component of our ecosystems. And lastly, we have humans, right? And as I mentioned in the beginning, even though we are animals, our ability to affect ecosystems is so great that we are included as our own separate category. And our effect on the ecosystems is widespread, from the conversion of land to cities, to logging, to actual development of agriculture, pollution, removal of certain species that have all these cascading effects. So we have these really wide-ranging effects we can have on an ecosystem. All right, so to review, an ecosystem is a community of living organisms and the abiotic or non-living environment in which they are found. And we have these four ecosystem components: geologic and soil features, climate, plants, animals, and other biota, and humans, that really make up an ecosystem and determine what plants are going to grow in an area. All right, and again, to reiterate, our crop systems are ecosystems. And the more a crop ecosystem varies from the natural ecosystem found in an area, the more inputs and resources are needed to sustain the crops. So really, what I'm talking about with that second part is this idea of sustainability. Right? And sustainability in whatever system we're talking about is just the ability to be maintained at a certain level. When we're talking about the environment, It typically means maintaining environmental resources or fostering this ecological balance where we're not just destroying nature, but we have this nice balance going on. And sustainability is better for the environment. And in the long run, it's generally cheaper and more efficient to be sustainable. If we're talking about agriculture, or if we're talking about another aspect of business or anything, generally, in the long run, sustainability is ideal. However, we often don't consider sustainability, or it's often overlooked. And there are a number of reasons why this may be. I think the big reason is that humans have a tendency to prioritize the short-term costs and benefits over long-term costs and benefits. And we do this intuitively, and we also do this in more like rigorous, calculated ways when we're actually doing a cost and benefit analysis. So I'm sure you probably are all familiar with cost benefit analyses. If you're not, really what you're doing when you're doing this is you are weighing up the costs of an action versus the benefits of the action. And you typically do that, if you're doing it like an actual cost benefit analysis, you'll convert the costs and benefits to monetary terms, and you weigh them out. And that kind of, if the benefits outweigh the costs, it's generally a good idea to go with that, whatever you're proposing, right? So the problem, like I said, is that we discount the long-term costs and benefits. We devalue those long-term things, right? And often, especially when we're looking at the environment, the effects of our environment happen in the long term, right? The costs happen in the long term. And, like I said, we devalue those costs. Now, there are good reasons why we do this, right? From an intuitive evolutionary standpoint, if you're a hunter-gatherer human and you're walking around and you find this really great berry patch, you might just eat all the berries because your resources are scarce and they're unpredictable. You don't know when you're going to see more again. So you're going to go eat everything right there, right? Because you don't know when your next meal is going to be. But as we have gotten more technologically advanced, as we are able to impact the world so much more, these effects are greater, right? Again, another good example of why discounting may be good. This is what I learned when I took microeconomics in college. Say you are dying of thirst, right? You're going to value a quart of water that you can have right now much more than 2 gallons of water that you can receive 2 weeks later, right? Because the need is so much greater right now than long term. They're going to be much more valuable, these short-term benefits, which makes sense. However, like I said, when we're looking at the environment, those long-term costs, they come to fruition over time, right? And we see that nowadays, as I'm going to give an example, right? So when we looked at the origin of agriculture, kind of skipped ahead to agriculture post-World War II, we saw there was this shift that promoted, and it was done both through government policies and changes in technology, that promoted these large monoculture farms, right? So the example there is a large farm that is producing corn. And it promoted this idea of plowing these fields, tilling these fields annually, and applying lots of fertilizer, herbicides, and pesticides. Now, the short-term effects were really beneficial, right? Initially, we had really increased yields, and we were making great profit on using this type of farming practices. Really great initially. However, in the long term, and what we're starting to see now, are all these detrimental effects. Probably the most pressing one and the most important is a loss of topsoil. So we'll look at it a little bit later, but that topsoil is that first top layer of your soil that contains the soil organic matter. So typically, in a good producing soil, we'll have about 3 to 6% soil organic matter. And that matter is your recently dead organic material like plant material, whatever insects, dead animal material that you may find in there, that gets broken down and is used by soil microbes and crops to grow. It also includes that living factor, so all those soil microbes, the fungi that are growing in the soil, that are breaking that recently dead material down. And then it also includes a very dead component that is the humus, which works to improve soil texture, and it does some other things about maintaining minerals in the soil, etc. Anyway, that soil organic material is found in your topsoil. And this method of farming has seen a reduction of topsoil. And with that reduction of topsoil, you see a reduction of mineral nutrition that is naturally found in your soil. So you have to keep adding more and more fertilizer, right? So you're seeing these decreasing yields with what you had been fertilizing, and now you have to keep bumping up your fertilizer. With the widespread application of herbicides and pesticides, you are starting to see some of these species adapt to them, and now we have to be either applying more pesticides or new pesticides. So this ever-increasing need and ever-increasing, we have to be putting more and more inputs into our system to maintain the yield that we got initially. All right, so we're seeing these effects that are occurring long-term starting to happen now. Now, if we are looking at this central idea, right, that the more a crop ecosystem varies from a natural ecosystem, the more inputs we are going to need to sustain it, we can see that that is what is occurring here, right? That cornfield that you see there is not a good example of mimicking nature. If we go out and we look at nature, we see that nature is usually much more diverse, right? We don't really see this large disturbance of soil naturally occurring in nature. It might be more localized to certain areas. And generally, if you're walking out, the ground is always covered. There aren't these extensive times or these periods of times where the soil is just plowed and uncovered. So one of the ways that we can improve this type of system is to try and mimic nature in these ways that I talked about, right? We could look to improve plant diversity in our fields. And this could be done in a number of ways. We could do some intercropping within our cornfields. We can improve some diversity in some plant rows that run alongside our fields. And what this can do, it can act to bring about natural pollinators. It can improve the diversity of your insect species, and that actually is beneficial in terms of maybe reducing some pests naturally. All right, and really more importantly, when we're talking about topsoil, is we can reduce or eliminate our tillage. There's a big push now to go no-till for a lot of systems, and it's for those reasons I talked about. That loss of topsoil is really, really damaging to a farm system. So by reducing or eliminating tillage, you are starting to increase and slowly rebuild your soil organic material, so you're getting those nutrients back into your soil. And importantly, you always want to have your ground covered. So you're either always have something growing, or instead of removing everything, you leave that material on, the dead material on there, to prevent the washing away or erosion of that soil. So these are some of the ways. This is where we are mimicking nature, and it's helping to improve the sustainability of our agriculture system. Right. So what are some of the other ways that we can do it? I already talked about that first there. Mimic characteristics of the ecosystem. Generally, our ecosystems are more diverse. We have minimal or more localized disturbance, right? So we're not just plowing an entire field. That you wouldn't really see that in nature often. Another real easy way to improve sustainability would be to match your crops to the natural habitat. Right? The example I'll talk about is blueberries and Hamilton. You're all familiar with Hamilton, I'm sure, blueberry capital of the world, right? Blueberries grow well in the pine barrens. It's the blueberry capital of the world because blueberries grow well in the pine barrens where Hamilton is found, right? They prefer more acidic soils, which you will find there due to the different soil characteristics of the pine barrens. and they're going to grow better there than they might in other areas. It's a really good example of matching your crops to the natural habitat, right? The more that your crops, the poorer the match, the more inputs you're going to need, right? If you want to grow watermelons, require a lot of water, and if you're living in a desert area, you may not want to grow them, right? Because you're going to require a lot of resources and a lot of inputs. So, ways to learn about your natural habitat. You have plant hardiness zones, which really look at the temperature of the area, and you can use that to match up what crops will grow good where you're located. Web Soil Survey is a really good resource. It's actually a map, and you can zoom into where you are at or the area of interest, and it'll give you information on the soils there. And then you can also utilize some different books. Plant Communities of New Jersey by Beryl Robichaud is a really good book. If you're interested in natural wild plant communities that you would find throughout the state, that's a great book and a great resource. And it has a lot of the information on those different components that we talked about in the beginning, those ecosystem components. And then another way to improve sustainability would be to utilize ecosystem services. So by ecosystem services, we kind of already talked about it a little bit. These are the natural beneficial services that different aspects of the ecosystem provide, right? So as an example, a really good one is mycorrhizae. So mycorrhizal fungi grow in association with plant roots, and they're found in association with wild plants all the time, right? These fungi form this symbiotic relationship with plant roots, and they help extract nutrients from the soil that plants wouldn't be able to access otherwise. Now, in return, the plants provide the fungi with some water, it protects it from soil pathogens, and it gives it a little bit of carbohydrates and other nutrients. So it's this nice symbiotic relationship between this fungi and these plant roots. Think of it like in that first lecture when I talked about the beetles that burrow into the trees and they carry that fungus along with them. And that fungus lets them access all these nutrients that they otherwise couldn't. Kind of a similar thing happening here. So traditionally, most crops and most crop ecosystems did not contain mycorrhizae because we supplied all this excess nutrients that they didn't really need the mycorrhizae to get at the nutrients in the soil. However, we are now supplying mycorrhizae fungi to some of our crops to reduce the need for chemical fertilizers. In our growing media that you may have seen in the greenhouse or at some time throughout your career there, you will see the greenhouse. The growing media that we typically use contains mycorrhizal fungi for that reason. One example, that's a kind of incorporating this natural thing that we can use to our benefit. Another example of kind of mimicking nature or utilizing ecosystem services is the Ruth Stout mulch method for our gardeners out there. This is kind of a neat gardening method. It's one which I have used and I've really enjoyed. And essentially, in this method, you are just covering your garden year-round with several inches of mulch. And that mulch can be leaves, straw, hay, etc. Now, the benefits to this is that mulch helps prevent erosion if you're prone to erosion in an area. It's going to, as that mulch breaks down, those living organisms in your soil is going to break down that organic matter. It's going to add nutrients to your soil that the plants could then take up. The mulch also helps to hold moisture in an area, so it kind of prevents the need for watering. And it's also great to suppress weeds, right? I am lazy in my gardening. I don't want to be weeding constantly, so you just throw some mulch down, covers up the weeds, and you don't got to worry about it. So again, here's an advantage of utilizing some natural aspects of an ecosystem, right? This natural way in which soil organic material is found in an ecosystem, how it breaks down and how that adds nutrients to your soil, and we're using that to grow our crops. Another cool example that we're going to watch a video of at the end of this is that farmers in Indonesia introduce fish and ducks into their rice fields. And what happens is the fish, their droppings act as fertilizer, and the fish also eat any insect pests and improve oxygen circulation around the field. The ducks will eat any weeds growing in their rice fields, and at the end of this, the farmers are able to harvest not only the rice, but also the fish and ducks and sell them in their market. So really good way of incorporating these different systems and utilizing it in a more integrated and sustainable way. So we're going to end by watching a little video of that. But before I get to the end, I just wanted to tell you, if you guys are interested in this, there are a number of terms that you can look up and do a little more research on your own. So agroecology, permaculture, sustainable agriculture, restoration agriculture, silvopasture, all different terms. They have slightly different meanings, but they're related to this idea of sustainability and utilizing the ecosystem with agriculture in a more sustainable way. Now that is it. We're going to watch this little video to end. I will also say that I don't have it included, but this is one way of reducing our inputs into if we're talking just about farming, reducing our inputs into a farm field, being a little more environmentally friendly. It's not the only way. There are also many people who are utilizing advances in technology to also decrease their inputs. And this is through drone technology, in particular, this automation, more targeted, all the sensors that they can use now, that allows for more targeted application of fertilizer, water, pesticides, etc. So it's not the only way what I talked about here, being more sustainable, utilizing environmental resources. That's a method that I like in general, but it's not the only way, and there are plenty of people who are taking different approaches, all really for the same idea of being more sustainable and being able to provide food, fiber, fuel into the future. Alright, so let's take a look now at this video, and that'll be it for this lesson.
Kalau kita dulu memakai bahan kimia itu kita berpikir bagaimana caranya untuk menghilangkan pupuk-pupuk yang mengandung kimia. Luasannya 670, Mbak. Bebek dan ikan. Dalam 1 hektarnya itu sudah diprediksi 10 ton. Nah, setelah itu kita mulai penggarapan lahan ini, Mbak. Nah, setelah sudah siap kita tanami, baru kita tanami. Nah, setelah tanam kita siapkan hewan bebek yang kita rawat itu. Kalau ikan itu bisa kita masukkan yang lebih awal. Kalau bebeknya setelah tanam kita dapat 2 minggu baru kita masukkan bebeknya. Saya tertariknya kan kita mengurangi biaya produksi untuk penyiangan, matun, kalau bebeknya itu, Mbak, ya. Untuk ikannya, nah itu untuk menambah ekonomi keluarga juga itu, Mbak. Dari hewan juga membantu untuk memakan hewan-hewan yang musuh musuh alami itu, Mbak. Dan kotorannya ikan itu kan bisa jadi pupuk juga itu. Kalau masalah ikannya, ikan itu kan kalau 4 bulan itu kita, meskipun bebeknya juga begitu, Mbak. Mencari kita otak terus, Mbak, ini sampai berhasil, sampai di mana kita mengolah lahan ini sampai berhasil lebih banyak lagi, jadi kita bisa menularkan sama petani-petani lainnya.